Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're joining us today. The purpose of our panel today is to discuss whistleblowing and how important it is to support government whistleblowers, how we can put protections forward for whistleblowers, and we can talk about scientific integrity principles, good governance, and all the different issues that come up around whistleblowing. We're going to try to offer some concrete steps today that participants can take to support whistleblower protections and government scientific integrity policies. So we welcome you all here today. We're glad you're joining us. Some of the things we'll be talking about are what it is like to be a whistleblower, who are whistleblowers, why do they come forward. We're going to talk about some of the private sector interests that might play a part in the decision of whistleblowers about whether to come forward or not. We're going to discuss the case of some EPA whistleblowers that PEER has been supporting for more than a year, I believe, and I have been writing about, and I should actually take a moment to introduce myself before I go any further. My name is Sharon Lerner, and I am a reporter for the Intercept. I cover the environment, and I actually have been writing about some whistleblowers that for the EPA who have been supported by PEER for more than a year. Anyway, back to what we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking about policy around whistleblowing, and we are going to hear from all our participants about their thoughts on the big takeaways and the big issues, both big and small, that we're talking about today. Throughout our discussion, we're going to really want to hear from all the participants, hear what people have to say. You can weigh in through the little Q&A button at the bottom there. We will be taking some of the questions as the conversation evolves, and some of them at the end. We'll leave about 15 minutes to talk about questions at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, or rather let our panelists introduce themselves. Okay, so let's start with Kyla Bennett. Welcome.
Thanks,
Kyla.
Sharon. Thank you. My name is Kyla Bennett. I have been working at PEER for 21 years. I have a PhD in ecology and a law degree, and I kind of wear two hats at PEER. I am PEER's Director of Science Policy, but I also am the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic Region Director. I used to work at EPA myself. I worked there in the 90s for just shy of 10 years, and I was a whistleblower, and that's how I met PEER, was being a whistleblower at PEER, at EPA. So I have a good sense of what people are going through, what our clients are going through.
Thanks, Kyla. Chandra Rosenthal, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Chandra Rosenthal, and I'm the Rocky Mountain Director of PEER, and I'm based in Denver, Colorado. I'm an attorney, and I spend about half my time for PEER working on public land issues. That's working with employees in land management agencies, the Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, Park Service, and about half of my time is spent on other issues that come into this region. And so PEER works with state employees as well as federal agencies and employees. And the reason I'm on the panel today is I'm currently working with 3 public whistleblowers who work for the state of Colorado on air pollution permitting. And we recently had a success. Thank you.
Great. Undine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I see some familiar names on the participants list. So welcome, fellow union reps at EPA. My name is Undine Kipkda. I'm president of AFGE Local 3428 and first VP of AFGE Council 238 at EPA. I'm basically a representative for an umbrella union that represents about 7,500 employees at EPA. Union reps at EPA are also employees. So I am also a current employee at EPA in EPA Region 1's Air Division. So that's the region that covers the New England states. So Kyla actually doesn't live that far from me. So I'm currently involved in a union contract negotiation with EPA, protecting workers who protect the planet, and plan to get into lots of good trouble trying to get that contract locked in, before things change. And EPA's leadership has different ideas on how they want to treat the union. But I'm here today because one of the ideas that our union has that we've discussed with peer about is to put additional protections into our contracts for employees that have concerns about scientific integrity, and the violations of scientific integrity principles that EPA is supposed to espouse in order to protect public health and the environment. So I'm really happy to be here and so glad to be invited. Thank you.
Great. Tim Whitehouse, would you like
Yes, thank you, Sharon. My name is Tim Whitehouse. I'm the Executive Director of PEER. And for those of you that aren't familiar with PEER, we are a small nonprofit located in Silver Spring. We have staff throughout the United States. And we're one of the few organizations in the country that represents environmental whistleblowers in federal, state, or local governments. We do that pro bono and without charge. Thank you, Sharon.
Great. Okay. So let's start with you, Tim, even though you're just finished talking. I'm hoping you can give us kind of an overview about what a whistleblower is, who a whistleblower is, and give us some examples, if you would, of prominent whistleblowers.
Sure. Well, whistleblowers have existed since the founding of the country. Some of the first whistleblowers were those in the Continental Army who were concerned that the admirals in the Navy were stealing money, and they were. And so they came forward at great cost to themselves to report that. So this country has a long history of people speaking up against corruption. And whistleblowers, as we now look at them through our lens, are individuals who work in either the government or in the private sector and who disclose abuses of power or other failings in their organization that, in the large sense, betray the public trust. There are a number of federal and state statutes that cover whistleblowing. And the essence of these is that people that make disclosures to the appropriate people or authorities are provided protection from retaliation. And so the most common act at the federal level used is the Whistleblower Protection Act. And that protects federal employees who make disclosures which the employee reasonably believes to be true about any violation of law, rule, or regulation, about gross mismanagement of funds or abuses of authority, or something about a substantial and specific danger to public health or safety. And these whistleblowers that make these disclosures that they believe to be reasonable and true are protected. They're also protected under whistleblower laws if they testify in another employee complaint, or if they assist investigative bodies, and if they refuse to obey orders which violate the law. So once you become a whistleblower, you're in a protected status and you cannot be retaliated against for becoming a whistleblower. I think there's a number of laws that cover whistleblowing. And the important thing is for people that are contemplating becoming a whistleblower to consult an attorney, because it's very important that you do it correctly and make sure you have the protections available to you that the laws provide. You asked about examples of whistleblowers. I think in the public realm, in the larger national psyche, I think, the national security whistleblowers are the ones that most people are familiar with. When I was growing up, it was Daniel Ellsberg who released the Pentagon Papers at a time during the Vietnam War when political leaders were painting the war in a very rosy picture, and the Pentagon Papers provided a very different perspective. More recently in the national security area, you've probably all remember, hopefully he doesn't fade from our consciousness too soon, Alexander Vendeman, who put his career online and suffered great consequences. He was a national security official who testified about abuses of power during the Trump-Ukraine scandal and suffered great consequences to his career as a result. But I think what we want to talk about is environmental whistleblowers. And just to put things in perspective, PEER, which is one of two groups that I know of nationally that represent environmental whistleblowers, we can represent up to 10, 15 whistleblowers a year. Most of these whistleblowers, their names are not released. It happens behind closed doors. The issues are either resolved or they're not resolved. But some of the whistleblowers we work with, the issues do become public. They are either through newspaper articles or through court proceedings. The issues do become in the public domain. And I want to mention a couple that we have worked with just to give you a perspective on the type of people that step forward. So one was Dr. Kate Jenkins, and she was an EPA scientist during the 9/11 Twin Tower collapses. You may remember that the politicians and the leader of EPA were saying the air was safe to breathe. And she, as an air person, knew that was not true and reported that the air was unsafe. And as a consequence, was ultimately fired from her job. And after years of legal struggle represented by PEER, she was completely vindicated. And we all know now, what a horrible suffering that people that were breathing that air went through. And they were misled by a number of people about the safety of that air. We've also represented Chief Teresa Chambers of the National Park Service. She waged a 7-year legal battle with PEER representation to overturn a termination for honestly answering a question a reporter asked her about resources. And she was the first female police chief who was concerned about the lack of resources. And she also was completely vindicated and restored to her position. I do want to say we represent, in other groups, whistleblowers in general, private practice, can represent people who work in landfills that are concerned about hazardous waste dumping, all the way up to economists in the World Bank or in the Army Corps of Engineers. So there's a wide, I would think every federal, state, and local agency at some point has had a whistleblower.
Thank you. Tim or Kyla, whichever of you wants to address this, tell me a little bit about the title of today's webinar, which is Good Trouble, Bad Trouble. What do you guys mean by that?
Go forth, Kyla.
Thanks, Tim. I think everybody remembers when Congressman John Lewis said, get in good trouble, necessary trouble, and redeem the soul of the nation. And I think it's a great title for this talk because we had one of our clients parrot that back to us, which kind of gave Tim the idea for the title for this webinar. He wanted to get into good trouble. And, good trouble as opposed to bad trouble is causing trouble for certain people for a good cause, for good reasons. And certainly with the cases that we're dealing with at PEER, these are all good trouble cases. These are cases where these employees are trying to protect the American public's health and they're trying to protect the environment. So that's what it stems from.
Thank you. So Kyla, how long have you been working with whistleblowers?
I have been working at PEER for 21 years, so a long time. Although the past 2 years working with these 5 EPA whistleblowers has really been the pinnacle of what I've been doing. It's been just crazy disclosures, things that they've disclosed, and really horrific examples of malfeasance at the agency.
Well, we will definitely come back to that. And before we do, though, I mean, given your kind of the span of the years that you've been working on this, can you say something about what generally drives someone to become a whistleblower? Who becomes a whistleblower and why?
Sure. I think one myth about whistleblowers is that these people are either disgruntled employees who are trying to get revenge, or they are people who are looking for fame and fortune. And I have not found that to be true. All of the whistleblowers that I've dealt with over the past 2 decades, they have become whistleblowers as a last resort. They don't want to be whistleblowers. Nobody wants to be a whistleblower. And trust me, having been one, I can tell you that it's not a pleasant place to be. You are a pariah, so it's not fun. You are coming forward because you have courage and integrity. And those are the people who really want to make a change, even if they're taking great risks personally. It is rarely good for their career, as Tim said at the very beginning. They never make money off of this, or very rarely do they. Sometimes they get compensated for all their pain and suffering, but that's not very often. So it's really a very selfless act. So it's people who have empathy, sympathy, who really care about others and who care about the environment, and who are willing to put other people and the environment before themselves.
So you mentioned some of the risks, and I'm hoping you'll talk a little bit about what it is that people face after they come forward. And I saw that there's a question in the chat about spouses. So I guess maybe if you want to talk about the spouses as well in terms of how they might suffer.
Sure. It's being a whistleblower is an incredibly emotionally draining thing, because think about it. You're at a job, you're working with people theoretically that you like. Sometimes you've been at a job for a long time, and you are making allegations that there's some wrongdoing that rises to a level of something pretty horrific if you're going to come forward and be a whistleblower. So the first thing that usually happens when you're a whistleblower is everybody's like, oh my God, what have you done? And people start to ignore you and push you to the side because they don't want to be associated with you, because they think that they're going to be accused of being a whistleblower as well if they hang out with you or talk to you or are friendly with you. But it's something that colors your whole world. And I found this, and I know my clients do as well. You bring it home with you. It's not something that you can just leave at the office. It's something that's all consuming, because you're fighting these big, powerful interests, whether it's a government agency or whether it's industry. You're fighting something and people who have a lot more power than you do. So I have seen clients have trouble with their spouses, get divorced, boyfriends and girlfriends break up. You don't have the time that you have for your children or for your own health. So it's really, there are so very many risks for whistleblowers, and it has to be something that they're prepared for. And a lot of people don't understand that it's never easy. It's never easy. It can be rewarding if they're vindicated, but it's never easy.
Thanks. Chandra, can you speak a little bit about your experience with whistleblowers in terms of why the people you've been working with have stepped forward?
It seems that people who come to PEER have a strong ethical compass and are often in dysfunctional workplaces. So they went into their job with a sense of purpose. In the case of the people who come to us to work on environmental issues, and then they see something that doesn't align with the law or ethics in their work, and then they speak out. And in some workplaces, this is appreciated or would be appreciated. However, because of politics, industry influence, or even middle managers who operate out of fear in their agency, they can be ignored or pushed down. And then they maybe reach a breaking point and decide to become public whistleblowers, or even just reach out to PEER and try and do some work anonymously with us. And at PEER, I think something that we see is really dedicated people who are truly experts and who are willing to put in the time to go through this process and be very persistent, because it is a very slow process to make change at some of these big agencies.
Yeah. So To what degree do you see industry influence over government having a relationship to whistleblowing? And I guess I would ask this of Kyla as well, both you, Chandra and Kyla. How big an issue is industry influence over government?
I think certainly, I think the influence of the energy industry has been a huge factor with the 3 Colorado climate whistleblowers and the oil and gas permitting process in Colorado. And that's oil and gas and coal permits. Businesses want their permits. They want them quickly. They don't want to put expensive controls. And they're always going to push agencies to see how far they can go. And then in public land management, you see also oil and gas leasing and ranchers who want unencumbered, cheap places to graze livestock. And we're also starting to see large scale solar farms and electric transmission lines exert the same sort of influence within government. So yeah, I think it's significant.
I'm curious.
Sorry. I was
Say a tiny bit more about the solar thing. I'm not sure I understand that. Meaning that, just tell me more about that, if you would.
So right now, public lands are, at least BLM lands have a multiple use mission. So that's recreation, that's oil and gas leasing, that's livestock ranching. And now they're starting to put large solar farms out on big swaths of public land. So they have to go through the permitting process the same way an oil and gas company would, where the environmental impact's being assessed. And they're also starting to push back in the same way that you might see, because it's a business, any other business pushing back.
Okay. Undine, please, so you're president of your local. Tell me a little bit about what your union does and also how the issue of scientific integrity is important to the AFGE.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things about being a current EPA employee is that you see, all these sort of pressures being exerted on your coworkers in real time, right? So, the risk that whistleblowers undertake, right? Like those stories that were just shared. I mean, that's those ring very true to me. I've seen people be afraid to speak out about a senior management decision when it comes to larger issues like what's the agency's position on climate change, and then also the smaller stuff on where to go on a particular permit or something like that. So it's these people that are so caring about the mission of the agency, protecting public health and the environment. They need as many protections as they can get, and any way to sort of even out the power differential between them and management, especially if you've got outside interests, right? Maybe speaking with the politicals at the highest levels, right? You need something to kind of even things out. So I see union representatives in the EPA workplace as being the type of people that you could come to with a concern. You could feel less alone in speaking out. You could come out with a joint message, so it's not just you that's being attacked by management, all these kinds of things, and even better if you can enshrine them in a contract that's sort of permanent and lasts maybe 10 years or something like that. That way you don't have to have people be silenced, and self-censor themselves on controversial topics so that they can avoid rocking the boat, right? And they don't have, if they manage to convince management that they're right, they don't have to become whistleblowers and put their entire career at risk, right? So I mean, I think in particular with scientific integrity, what we there are a lot of really talented scientists at the agency working on issues that affect industry, right? The energy industry in particular. And so, sometimes, I think there's everything that, an EPA employee touches can be considered controversial, right? And so and with climate change in particular, like if you can't even say the words climate change in the workplace, if you feel like you can't even speak out about that, how are you supposed to get your work done in order to put rules in place, that protect, public health and the environment, and how are you supposed to, set the rules up in such a way that you're controlling greenhouse gas emissions so that we can ensure a healthy and livable planet for future generations, right? So it's, I see this sort of these pressures, that we're sort of speaking about, like play out in real time. And I really hope that with our plan to roll in a contract article specifically for scientific integrity protections and locking that in for our folks will prevent the kinds of situations that you've reported on, and Kyla and Chandra have sort of been speaking about at the agency. And I think that'll be key, especially if we have another administration that maybe not so environmentally friendly, let's say, like it's not a priority as much, because I think what I've sort of observed is that the people who tend to go after unions, who go after people who push hard for environmental issues, like the I think the people who don't particularly listen to scientists very much, these tend to all be the same types of people. So right. That's it. Thanks.
Very interesting about the climate change related issues. I imagine there's an uptick. That's what you're saying, right? They're on the increase still, would you say?
Yeah, I would say, I think under the Trump administration, it was difficult. I found myself self-censoring, and I knew better, right? And so, like, in order to prevent that same, given how important that issue is in particular, in terms of protecting the planet, I think it's to ensure that a climate scientist at EPA is not their work isn't interfered with.
But would you say that these are ongoing climate issues that you're seeing in the union under the current administration?
I would say there's probably still there was quite a lot of fear about speaking out under the last administration. I think that culture is sort of still there. So I would say I couldn't point to a specific issue of somebody's work getting interfered with or anything like that, but I would say the fear has not dissipated yet. So, like, in order to make people feel comfortable and then bolster the protections for if things change is just really critical.
Yeah. Tim, did you want to say something about industry influence here?
No, I think it's been said. But just that's a driving factor for whistleblowers coming forward.
For sure. Kyla, you have been working, as you mentioned, for more than a year with a group of whistleblowers from the EPA. I have actually been writing a lot about those same people. I'm hoping you can tell everybody a little bit about these folks in that situation.
Sure. So it's been almost 2 years. They came to us on September 11th, 2020, which is at the very tail end of the Trump administration. And initially 3 whistleblowers came to us from EPA headquarters, working on, they were all in OPPT, the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. They were working on, they brought us disclosures about the new chemicals division. So what we learned from these people is how horrific really the entire division down there that oversees pesticides and new chemicals. And we tried at first to work within the agency, filing a scientific integrity complaint. We realized that even though the scientific integrity policy sounds good, there's no enforcement mechanism. So that went nowhere. So we finally then moved to the Inspector General and filed a number of disclosures with the Inspector General. I have to point out that Sharon just won 2 awards today for her reporting on these stories. So you should absolutely go read them if you haven't. But our very first disclosure to the EPA that Peer did was based on a pesticide, telone. And that one, the reason I just wanted to mention that one quickly is that the IG did come out with their report on this one, and they vindicated absolutely everything that we said. So I am hopeful that the Inspector General will also be vindicating our clients, who's now, the number is now moved up to 5 people, as they start working on these additional disclosures. But in the case of telone, which is a pesticide, EPA, they have to do a literature search for studies that show whether this pesticide is harmful, presents risk, has any human health impacts, environmental impacts. And in this particular case, EPA used the wrong search term. They didn't use the name of the chemical. That's how awful it was. I mean, that's just crazy to me that a scientist would use the wrong search term. They only came up with 8 studies because they used the wrong search term, and they dismissed all of them because they weren't relevant. When the IG did the exact same search with the right search term, they came up with 100 studies. So basically in that case, EPA downgraded the cancer classification for this pesticide when they shouldn't have. So that's horrific. And even more horrific is the fact that now that happened under the Trump administration, but under the Biden administration, instead of agreeing with the IG that they were going to try to redo this, they said, no, we think it's good the way it is. Thanks. So even though the Trump administration was horrific, problems have not disappeared under the Biden administration. So these other disclosures, and we have 5 of them so far, we've got more coming. The biggest takeaway point is that managers and career staff at EPA in this division of new chemicals have been systematically deleting hazards from the risk assessments. And I don't think a lot of people understand how these things are done. People have this vision of EPA employees in white lab coats with clipboards in the lab and Erlenmeyer flasks and doing these studies, and that's not the way it works. These scientists have 90 days to figure out whether a particular chemical coming on the market will cause risk to human health or the environment. And sometimes the only information they're given is the name of the chemical and an abstract written by the industry, the very industry who's trying to get this chemical on the market. And they have 90 days to say, yes, this presents risk, or no, it doesn't. So oftentimes they don't even have the information that to make those risk assessments. And even though EPA under the law, TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, they have the ability to ask the submitter for additional information, EPA is very reluctant to do that. EPA wants to get these things out as quickly as possible, and they do not prevent any chemicals from entering market. Since 2016, EPA has not prevented one chemical from going onto the marketplace. So they are finding that all of these are okay for one reason or another. And not only do the managers delete risks, but they have this category of cases called hair on fire cases. If an industry submitter complains or calls their congressional to complain, it's automatically assigned this hair on fire status where it's rushed through without proper controls. So we've been finding so many cases through these clients of, I would call it malfeasance, that is ending up presenting risk to factory workers, to fence line communities, and to the general population. Some of these chemicals, you can go to Home Depot or Lowe's or Walmart or Target and buy things off the shelf that can harm you, that can harm the environment. And EPA is just approving these things willy-nilly, and it's horrible.
Wow, thank you. I know that there is way more that you can say about that, but in the interest of time, and I think we should return to it in the questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to actually move on to ask Chandra about the whistleblower cases that you mentioned earlier, and if you could just tell us a little bit more about the issues that you guys are facing out there.
So we have, so actually, if you listen to Kyla, who's working with 5 employees who came forward, and then we have these 3 employees in Colorado who've come forward also together. This is really unusual, though. Usually we get one person at a time. So it's kind of striking, but these 3 climate whistleblowers, they work in the Air Pollution Control Division. So the air in Colorado, particularly in the Front Range around Denver, it's terrible. We have a lot of oil and gas development, and these 3 scientists were tired of seeing the state rubber stamp air pollution permits for industry, even though they weren't in compliance with the Clean Air Act. So these employees are the only 3 air scientists who do this type of work came to PEER. And with them, we went to the EPA, that's the federal agency that oversees the state Clean Air Act implementation. And we filed a complaint with the EPA Office of Inspector General. So last month, about a year later, EPA came out with a report, and they confirmed the whistleblowers' complaints, and they made recommendations to the state on how to reform the permitting process. And I think that this case is a good example of how we've used a broad outreach strategy to make change. So before the whistleblowers came forward publicly as a group, we were working using the state whistleblower law to bring information on specific air permits to light. So in Colorado, we have a state law that allows you to work with a legislator to invoke retaliation protections. So we brought documents to a legislator, and a legislator who then legally made them public. So then we were able to use them in the press and for comment letters. And then we also rallied a lot of support with conservation groups and in the press for these whistleblowers. And I think that it's really important to work with smart media people like you, Sharon, and we worked with Michael Booth at the Colorado Sun in Colorado. So people that can make the connection between the technical issues that the whistleblowers are raising, and then the broad public health issues. So people understand that the air stinks, but they might not understand like exactly how the permitting process works for minor sources. We also worked with a lot of the conservation groups and members of the public to bring up the whistleblowers anytime that there was like an open public comment period. And I think then the conservation community really embraced these employees as their own. So it wasn't just a peer issue. And so this created a lot of pressure in the state to do something. And so in this case, the state attorney general also opened up a special investigation into the permitting process. So that's something that we haven't seen before in other cases. We also worked with state legislators. So they were working on air legislation, and we worked with them to include provisions in the legislation that would address the capacity in the section of the air division where the whistleblowers worked. So there were just, now there's just one air modeler right now working for the state. And I think that they have the ability to hire 4. So kind of another angle for addressing this. And then finally, we filed the complaint with the Office of Inspector General. And one other avenue that we pursued, and it was initially unsuccessful, was we reached out to the governor's office, and we were ignored until a couple of days before the EPA OIG report was released. And so he recently requested a response to the state requesting that how are they going to address the whistleblower issues. So it was really working with all of these different groups and raising the issue in a number of different ways to keep the media engaged and the issue elevated and persistent.
Thank you. So I think we should all say a little bit, if we can, about solutions, how we address this problem. And I'm going to just read from one question from the Q&A, which is, do whistleblowers do whistleblowers have legal protections when their professional reputations are smeared by industry spokespersons? In response to information they've shared. So I think that is, one question that could be addressed, but the broader thing, I'd love to hear from everybody about is like, how do we solve these problems? How do we protect whistleblowers? Tim, do you want to start?
I'll jump in with
Thanks.
one. Yeah, I'll jump in with one. I think, first of all, I want to say what the union is doing, AFGE, is really important to get the scientific integrity policy into contracts and to strengthen it is key, because we have found, as mentioned, that policy is very weak and basically does nothing to protect people. But one thing that needs to happen, and we'll send an email around with more follow-up, is the whistleblower protection laws need to be strengthened. And there's some bills before Congress to do that. And whistleblowing has normally had bipartisan support, and it still does. So there are a number of recommendations that we have and other groups have, and a number of good bills in Congress that might have a chance to pass in the next year or so to strengthen whistleblower protections. The other thing that I would say, just one more quick thing, is there needs to be more transparency in government. Since I've been when I was in government in the 1990s, and I find our government becoming less and less transparent, and more information is being held as confidential business information or withheld from the public. So we need greater transparency.
Undine, do you want to say something on the solutions question?
Sure. Yeah. I think Tim's kind of spoke to it. I mean, I see the union contract, and specifically like including protections for employees, current employees, like related to scientific integrity, say if they're doing climate work, as sort of a way to enhance the protections that may already exist out there, right? And so to the extent that we can put forward ideas that the agency agrees with, and locking those in, I think that's a way to ensure that EPA does the right thing, right, for the public. And so, I'm hopeful that, we'll be able to make some progress, this year on this contract. These contract negotiations tend to take time, right? But it does, I don't think federal agencies at this point like to admit that they make mistakes, right? So it's kind of hard to get into the conversation, where they say, okay, yeah, your manager's implementing your scientific integrity policy and not involving the union. That kind of didn't work, right? We're proposing an alternative. So I do expect a detailed discussion that may get heated on our hands, but I think it's the right thing to do, for the employees who work so hard for the agency, right? They're really trying to do the right thing, and for the public and everybody here. So
I agree with everything that Tim and Undine said, but I think also the big thing that's missing is holding people accountable. And also, we have to stop the revolving door. There's one situation in the chemicals division at EPA headquarters where one manager who has been a problem has been back and forth between EPA and industry 4 times. So that's I think a real problem. And also we need to name names. Thank goodness for the IG, but unfortunately the Inspector General's recommendations are not necessarily, EPA is free to dismiss them, which they tend to do. I would love to see the IG have more power to actually implement the changes that they are suggesting.
Thanks. Anybody else want to say anything about solutions before we go on to just direct questions? Okay. So we've hit some of the direct questions already, but I'm going to read one now from Bill Hersey, which is about unions. Okay, any progress toward getting union representation on the Scientific Integrity Committee at EPA's Office of Scientific Integrity? And he follows up, what about filing a negotiability appeal at FLRA reunion representation on that committee? There's contract language about negotiability of disputes over interpretation of policy. So Undine, I think that's for you.
Yeah, hi, Bill. I think Bill is a retiree member of NTU Chapter 280, which represents employees out of EPA's DC offices. I think some of the program offices. So, we've come in contact with each other from time to time during the union discussion. So, I think to answer Bill's, I think, first questions about the negotiability appeal and the union membership as part of the Scientific Integrity Committee, I think the agency calls it now. Those are basically our solution, for our union council is to negotiate a contract article to cover that, right? So as part of our first proposal to the agency on scientific integrity, we are demanding that the agency provide AFGE seats on the committee that they currently have set up, which is currently management only, right? Which means that management gets to decide how to hold themselves accountable when issues like this come up. And I think we've I personally think that isn't working. It seems like, folks on the line here would agree that it isn't working. And so what we want to do is make sure that the union has a seat at the table during this discussion. But in terms of a negotiability appeal, I think we would only pull that trigger if the agency flat out says we can't put any of this in a contract, right? So we're not quite there at the decision point yet to start that process. Just for folks on the line who aren't used to union speak, the FLRA is the Federal Labor Relations Authority. So like if there's a dispute between a union and an federal agency on something that the union or the agency does or does not want to put into a contract, they go to this referee to kind of figure it out. So I think what we want to do is make sure that we have a seat on this committee so that we understand what the agency is actually doing. And then what we also want to do is try to use the union appeal process called a grievance to take disputes that can't be resolved, between an employee's union representative and management, and take them outside of the agency, away from the manager bubble, in front of an independent arbitrator. But as I said, we haven't locked this into a contract yet, so we're going to fight really hard to try to do that, because we think it's going to work so much better than the current EPA scientific integrity policy, which is implemented only by management right now.
Tim, did you also want to address this question? It looks like. Okay.
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself. There's a really important issue to be very explicit about in our experience in the scientific integrity policies. So the idea was, I think after the Bush administration in the early 2000s, that scientists needed more protection in the federal government. And so these scientific integrity policies were developed under the Obama administration with the best of intentions. However, our experience is they've actually had the opposite effect in most instances, not all, whereby someone files a scientific integrity complaint, and then the way the process works is they're outed sort of as a troublemaker, because there's no assurances that the people that allegedly violated the scientific integrity rules are involved in the process of deciding what to do about it. And also there's no enforcement mechanism. So our experience with the scientific integrity policies have been that they don't work. And in fact, sometimes they have the opposite effect of what they're intended to do. So the Biden administration is relooking at these scientific integrity policies, but they do need to have enforcement mechanisms. It would be wonderful if they're part of union contracts. Otherwise, they have the opposite effect. And particularly as our country is sort of descending into a place where science is constantly under attack, we need to create the protections, not only whistleblower protections, but scientific integrity protections. And they go hand in hand, because if you have good scientific integrity policies, those can resolve most of the issues and you'll need fewer whistleblowers.
Thank you. So I have this Q&A box, and there's one question that says, why are government agencies so corrupt? And then on my screen, it says that Kyla Bennett is typing an answer. And it said that for a few minutes, so I can only assume this is a very long answer. But anyway, I'm really curious if anyone wants to try to tackle that question. Why are government agencies so corrupt? Otherwise, we can go on to the top 3 takeaways. But I'm intrigued.
Sharon, I was typing and then I erased it because so that's why that happened. But the bottom line, I think in some cases it is money. I do think it's money. I think we have cases where EPA employees have spouses who work in the industry, for example, or this revolving door. These managers know that if they do favors for industry, that they can then leave the agency and go get a job there afterwards that's much better paying than what they make at the agency. But for some, I don't know. It's like the $64,000 question. I have reporters ask me that all the time, like, why do they do this? And personally, I don't know how they can sleep at night. I don't know how they can look at themselves in the mirror. But I think for some people, it's just easier to not to make waves. And if they get pressure from industry or from Congress or even from managers, they'll just do it because they don't want to deal. They don't have that courage and the integrity. Maybe they are the sole breadwinner in their family and they're too afraid to, make waves and get in trouble. So there might be some innocent reasons that this is happening, but I think a lot of it does come down to money.
Thank you. Follow the money. Okay. So I think we, unless anyone else has any burning questions, can move on to just like our top takeaways from the panelists, if each of you want to share those.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll just say, I've loved working at EPA, and I so respect my coworkers who work so hard to protect human health and the environment, with fighting climate change being sort of like the issue that I put right on the top level myself. I think we really want to make sure these employees who, basically do the bread and butter scientific work and keep the federal government running and keep them, from enacting, keep them from implementing, keep them implementing their mission. Those folks are protected. I think under the last administration, we saw, these institutions be vulnerable to these these sort of outside interests and agencies coming out with all kinds of very strange decisions, right? And I think making sure that the career staff can step in to stop that from happening, and empowering those folks is really, really important. I think another thing which Kyla spoke to very eloquently is just this idea, managers, who are paid more to do this very important work, they can kind of go into survival mode sometimes, right? Or maybe more, maybe they are motivated by another job, that they might see, in the private sector that they're sort of eyeing, right? If they if they cannot hold themselves accountable, there needs to be some other enforcement mechanism in place. As we talked about, like the union contract and enforcing it through grievances is one way to do that. But we really need to. It's important right now to be able to make sure that we can move forward. To continue implementing the EPA's mission. And so I think, we really need to think about, how, there's, if we can find ways to sort of improve like these systemic issues and
Thank you. I think I actually have to move on to Chandra.
Oh, sorry.
We have 2 minutes,
I'll
but
stop.
thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Undine.
Yeah.
Okay, Chandra.
Yeah, so I think it's important to make these connections. So weaving the threads together so that people can draw the lines between good government and resource protection. And then really looking to all of the different options. So I'm thinking of oversight agencies, the OIG, the legislative oversight committees, local representative, ombudsmen, advocacy groups, government accountability groups, and really getting a lot of pressure from local environmental groups. And then my third point is like advocacy in putting forward good stories with tips from these employees, working with unions, and letting other conservation groups know that we're able to provide some expertise that is within the agency if the employees can stay anonymous.
Thank you. So I guess Kyla and Tim, you could be super quick if we want to make it by 5.
Sure. For me, it's this malfeasance that's going on is nonpartisan. It's not just the Trump administration. It's happening under all administrations, including this one. It's not just political appointees. It's also career staff who survive administration to administration. And finally, whistleblowers do it as a last resort. They're doing it at great risk, and they deserve all of our, we should be grateful for them for coming forward and having the courage to come forward, because they are protecting human health. They're protecting you, and they're protecting the environment.
Thank you. Tim?
Thank you. So a couple things. One is toxic chemicals need to be considered on the same par as climate change and biodiversity loss, is my opinion. I think whistleblowers are struggling under the Biden administration also. And any national health or environmental agenda should include strengthening and improving good governance, which includes whistleblower protections, government transparency, and scientific integrity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who attended today, just for your attention and interest in the subject. Here is contact info for the folks you just heard, including Kyla Bennett at PEER and Undine Kipkda. I believe you can also find Tim and Chandra also at PEER. So, and I bet if you go to the website, peer.org, you will find contact info for them all. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.